Welcome everybody to History Room Live. My name is Jill. I'm the archivist and special collections librarian at Patent Free Library. History Room Live is a weekly Zoom session where we share collections and resources related to local history and genealogy. I'm going to let Karen introduce our speaker because she knows him a little bit better than I do, although we're getting to know each other better. So Karen, why don't you go ahead?
Jill, before you start, I think people should mute themselves during the presentation because we're getting this back noise.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's a great suggestion, Karen. So thank you, everyone, for muting yourselves. Okay, Karen, go ahead.
All right, hello. I'm Karen, and I have been, I've been volunteering at the History Room for several years, and Jack joined us 2-ish or so years ago, and it's been fabulous working with him in the History Room. He's actually been volunteering at the library far longer, though, because he's involved with the Teen Council, first as a team member, and now, I guess, technically as the adjunct coordinator is what a new title for him. So he's helped coordinate several events in the library, and also he's been helping with Main Street Bath. He is also currently a library and archives assistant. You might find him sometimes at the reference desk. He has a bachelor's degree, double degree, history and English, which he finished in 3 years. He is currently working on his MLS at Simmons with an archival track. And the newest news, he is now a board member for Bath Historical Society. And of course, if you've joined us within the last few weeks, you will have seen his story map session. And if you've not seen it, go back and watch it. So I know from that one especially, and from what I know of him, that this will be a fantastic program. So take it away, Jack.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen, so much for that introduction. Let's see, so I guess everyone sort of knows that today we're going to be talking about architectural history, so I guess I have a presentation that I'm going to give a lovely little slideshow that I've thrown together, and it's mostly going to be focusing on architecture sort of as an artistic movement is the track that I wanted to take, but was in part inspired because there are a lot of things on architectural history, but there tends to be sort of a barrier to entry of like some very basic knowledge that a lot of books assume that people have. And when I've talked to some people who I recommended like, oh, try reading this book if you want to start learning about old buildings and old houses. And then they go, well, but there are some terms in there that I just don't get. And so the purpose of this is to hopefully facilitate like a very entry-level overview of like, here's architectural history and a lot of the why of some of the building styles that are popular for a time. So I guess without further ado, then I can probably just start sharing my screen and we can get into it. Let's see if I can remember how to do that. All right, so I think we should be good, right? We can see our presentation. Let me just make it full screen. I'll hit play on. There we go. We can still see it. Everything's okay? Okay. All right, so as I said, this is a talk about architectural history and sort of an artistic interpretation of it, as opposed when also then including some historical groundings in it, because I love to babble on about history for a very long time. So rather than getting into a lot of the nitty-gritty details of like the minutiae of styles, it's sort of a broad overview of some of the most popular styles, and specifically those that we see a lot of in Bath, as opposed to trying to do all of architectural history in 45 minutes, which would be impossible. So this is just sort of my slide, you know, talking about everything that I've just gone over. The purposes of this are to explore the artistic and historical contexts of the architectural styles that are common in Bath, to cover some of the aesthetic and structural components that define them. Again, not the little details or how to look at any house. That will actually be another presentation about how to start looking at houses and picking up the styles, but this is not to do the little things, it's more the big picture, like what are the defining characteristics of some of these styles if you had to boil them down to a handful of things, and what were the inspirations and reasons that we got to those. And then also to establish some basic vocabulary terms that are used in the discussions of those things, like what is a pilaster and how is it different from a column? We'll end up going over that because that tends to confuse some people. But you like when you tell them, oh, these buildings will have pilasters on them, but if you don't know what a pilaster is yet, it's really hard to know how to look for a pilaster. So just going over a few basic terms while talking about it. But first we need to cover some European history. And now that I have intimidated you with this horrifying AP Euro timeline that I remember from when I was taking it myself in high school, we're not going to get nearly this detailed, that this is going to be a very brief overview of sort of what's happening in Europe after the fall of Rome and the end of classicism. And this probably sounds like we're taking a very far step back from talking about Bath and 19th century buildings, but it is very important because, I mean, this is the end of the classical era ends roughly about 476 when the Western Roman Empire collapses, and then Europe ends up in what we tend to call the Dark Ages from about 476 until around 0800-ish. These, the specific ranges of things like the Dark Ages and different periods of the medieval era are subject to an awful lot of debate. There isn't quite a consensus on exactly when does the Western Roman Empire collapse, because it's a very gradual process. But here we have a painting, ironically enough, from the Renaissance of one of the most famous sackings of Rome, and which some people put forward that was actually in the 450s rather than the 470s. I basically take a lot of these time here, just sort of a grain of salt, but they are general ranges that we use to talk about things. And then the Dark Ages themselves, why they are called that is because once the Roman Empire falls, Western Europe sees widespread decentralization, deurbanization, and frequent wars, because sort of the overarching body that was the Roman Empire isn't around anymore. And so it splits into a number of much smaller kingdoms and territories and states, and they're constantly vying for who's going to take over and, you know, become the next Roman Empire. Spoilers, no one really succeeds in that for at least 1,000 years or so. But that doesn't stop all of them from trying, because everyone's convinced that they have the right to be the Roman emperor, more or less. And especially the deurbanization, I think, is important to point out, because while the Roman Empire is around, you have large cities, people are living in cities. I mean, the Romans actually had something that more or less resembles modern air conditioning. Not quite modern, but they did have air conditioning. And yet, when the empire collapses and the administrative systems collapse, then you have people who are leaving the cities and they are moving to the countryside. And this eventually sets the stage for what we think of with, you know, the rural peasantry and their feudal lords that we associate with the medieval era, is as a result of this deurbanization. Although I will also point out, and I think this is important, that this entire talk is mostly focusing on Western architectural traditions and therefore Western European history, because that's what's under. There is an awful lot else going on during this time, and the rest of the world is not going through a dark age. Western Europe is. There's still the Eastern Roman Empire, better known as the Byzantine Empire. They're doing fine. Actually, throughout the Middle East, they are sort of thriving, because around, I think it's in the 630s is when you have the Prophet Muhammad and the rise of Islam. And so other parts of the world are actually doing perfectly well and don't really experience any serious challenges after the Roman Empire falls. But Western Europe does. And I just want to point out, so that we're focusing on Western Europe, but that is not all of history or all of anything, but that's just the part that we're talking about, because that's what ultimately influences basically the architecture in America, which is, anyway, that caveat aside, we'll move on to the proper, now the Middle Ages begin after the Dark Ages end, and that's, as you said, it is around 800 when Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And one of my favorite things I ever learned in AP Euro was that the Holy Roman Empire was not Holy Roman or an empire. So it's actually based in Germany, and it more or less sort of derives its authority from the church. Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope at the time, but it's not really holy. It's certainly not Roman, and it's not properly an empire because it doesn't actually hold any territories that are like overseas or colonial. So, but that's still, for the first time, you see re-centralizations of authority in what becomes Germany, though it only lasts about 14 years because Charlemagne does die in 814, and then his kingdom is entirely splintered amongst his sons, and eventually Germany devolves into several hundred very small princely states. You don't need to remember any of these details, just sort of the gist of what we're talking about. The Middle Ages, we see a recovery of centralization, and we start to see the emergence of modern states we recognize, because the Anglo-Saxons in England are forming, I wouldn't really call it a state, it's a kingdom. The Franks are forming what will eventually become France. The Germanic kingdoms are forming, although they don't actually unify into the Germany that we understand until the 1870s. But sort of we see the basis of Western Europe as we know it starts to coalesce around this time. And it's also when feudalism becomes the dominant governing model, which is that you have the peasantry and they are subject to a feudal lord who controls a small territory, like a fief usually, that surrounds one town, and then he has someone above him, like you might have a count who controls the county, and then the count is underneath a duke who controls a duchy, and then the duke is loyal to the king. Basically creates this, it's a very complex system in which ultimately we are able to have kingdoms form because you sort of have a chain of loyalty that is created. Also very significant is that mass Christianization is taking place during this time as they are converting all of the pagan peoples, especially of Northern Europe. Western Europe has generally converted by this point. One of the first French, not really France yet, but the first French kings converts to Christianity after having, oh, I forget exactly which battle it is, but anyway, he says that he'll convert if he wins a battle, and he does. So suddenly the French are Christian, and at this point, Christian means Catholic because we still have not had a Protestant Reformation. So whenever you hear Christian, understand it is really one branch, and that is Catholicism. But during the Middle Ages, once we have this beginning of re-centralization, this is when Gothic architecture starts to shape up. It still takes 300 years, you might notice, after Charlemagne until we really get into the swing of Gothic architecture. But by the 1130s, we start building marvelous cathedrals, usually in Western Europe. And it's important to note that these buildings are usually cathedrals. They are religious buildings because ultimately at the time, authority is still derived almost exclusively from the Catholic Church, which is based in Rome. And religion also tends to be a very visual thing at the time, in the sense that the reason that you have these very elaborate cathedrals is because it's sort of demonstrating the temporal authority of the church, and also how it is so much better than you, the common peasant, could not possibly aspire to be as great as it is. Because if you think about the fact that really these Gothic cathedrals are some of the first truly significant public, in a sense, structures that have been seen since the days of the Roman Empire, which at this point is 700 years removed from the people who are alive, they don't conceive of buildings the same way that we do, because these large structures actually took hundreds of years to complete. Like, it was truly a massive undertaking and a massive feat, and that's part of what made it so impressive, and why it really did show that, you know, the church is an absolute authority at the time. But, okay, so that's more or less the end of our Middle Ages history. Now we'll actually talk about the Gothic architecture, which you might notice based on this lovely picture that's Notre Dame in Paris, many of you may recognize. They tend to feature pointed arches, which we can see. There are a few of them there, especially in the lower levels. We have the lovely arches that come up to these nice points. The insides are supported by ribbed vaults that are more or less made of those same arches, and that is how you can have these incredibly high ceilings. And those are also then supported by the flying buttresses, which are sort of they're the parts that come off of the buildings and sort of look like legs. It sort of makes it bear a certain resemblance to an insect, a very pretty insect, but, you know, they're a bit leg-like, and those are also there, and that is what enables you to have these massively high ceilings and these massive structures, is the understanding of how to support them. Because it wasn't that they didn't necessarily want to have big buildings before now, it was that it took a significant amount of time to relearn the ability of how do you get this much stone to stay up. So, around the time that these churches are being constructed, though, this is where I'm going to point out again that other things are going well for other people. You might see the Roman Empire that is labeled on the eastern end of the map. That is the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. That's sort of a different Rome. Like, we're not going to get too much into Roman history, but they are actually experiencing more or less a golden age at this time under the Macedonian dynasty, I believe. Things are going really well for them, and they have sort of been the center, in a sense, of the Western world in Constantinople for a very long time, because it was the one prominent Roman city that did not completely disappear, more or less. Whereas Rome and Italy, not looking good. It's still not looking good around the 1100s, really. And then also, if you look sort of in northern Africa and into Spain, a lot of those are Islamic kingdoms or caliphates. Like the one that is in Spain there is known as it's centered in Cordoba. Basically, the Islamic world also doing really well, a center of scientific progress and learning. Things are going great in non-Western Europe still.
Currently, your available credit is 12,000.
And this is sort of how the world continues until we get to the Renaissance, which starts about in the 1300s. So it takes another 200 years, and Gothic architecture is actually still very prevalent during this time. And these periods, of course, aren't clear-cut. Like, we choose dates to give a general indication of about when things are changing, but all of these transitions are very gradual and they take place over time. So the Renaissance occurs because you have the re-centralization of authority in places that has now been around for a few hundred years in most cases. The power of the church actually helps to then in turn lend authority to temporal authorities, which are your kings who have divine rights to rule. Basically, everything is sort of coming back together, and we are getting closer to Roman times in terms of the ability of states to exist and defend themselves and do things like have art and architecture. And there is also increased trade between, so the Western European countries, now that they have restabilized, are able to trade more with places like the Byzantine Empire and those Islamic kingdoms and caliphates that we saw. And in that sense, actually, a lot of classical knowledge ends up coming back to Western Europe because it had disappeared from study in Western Europe with, the collapse of centralized authorities that weren't around to run things like schools and provide proper educations. But in other places, that didn't end. And so a lot of classical Greek and Roman texts actually come back to Europe after being translated from Arabic, where they had been translated from the original Greek, and they return again. And when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire in the 1450s, you have a massive exodus of Greek-speaking peoples from the Eastern Roman Empire that end up bringing with them their classical Greek texts. Basically, the Renaissance does see a resurgence of interest in the classical world and the ideas that they held. And so they also start looking at some of the ancient Roman ruins that are around and thinking, wow, how did they do that? And how could we do that again? This is the point at which sort of Rome truly becomes the Roman Empire becomes an aspiration again, and a feasible one at that, as people have more time to devote interest to hobbies like the arts and architecture and classical literature. And ultimately, this results in, all architecture neoclassical. From the point on, more or less. Gothic, again, it takes time to phase out, but there is such a serious interest in neoclassical forms that it takes us until about the 1800s before we start to move away again from neoclassical structures. But now, saying that, we're actually going to jump ahead to the 1700s, when classical architecture or classical forms, I should say, are still very much a part of how architecture is conceived of. The federal style is the American version of a neoclassical style that's very popular in Europe at the time. It's called the Adam style. It's after a group of 3 Scottish brothers who were all architects. Their last name was Adam, and they had a certain interpretation of Georgian architecture before that. But the first American architects draw from Adam style architecture, and we end up with the federal style, which is popular from about 1780 to 1830. It has its biggest height there in 1785 to 1815. And it's sort of, especially a reinterpretation of Roman architecture that is inspired by the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which by this point we have archaeological digs in there looking at these ancient Roman ruins and taking inspiration from those in how buildings at the time should be constructed. And so here I'm going to compare, there's New York City Hall that's built in New York City, and just compared to some of the ruins that are at Pompeii. Then you can sort of see where this inspiration is coming in, where you have these nice lines of columns forming a portico in front of your entrance. There's a second row above them. Just, this is where the inspiration is coming from. And this is what federal architectures are defined by, are these, a lot of Roman elements and flourishes. And so, and Renaissance interpretation, I should say Renaissance-ish interpretations of those classical elements. So we have things like entablatures, which an entablature is what sits on top of columns. It is the lovely sort of carved part that more or less only serves a decorative purpose. It's divided into 3 sections where you have the architrave, that's sort of the bottom that tends to go out, and then there's a frieze line above that, and then at the top you have a cornice. So they're entablatures that sort of surmount buildings, especially along our roof lines. Palladian windows, which is what you sort of see in the top right there, and that is a single arched window in the middle with 2 rectangular windows to the sides. You can also have sort of an impression of a Palladian window. You might see more 3 rectangular windows, but there's an arched section over the middle one to suggest a Palladian window, even when you don't have a proper one. And you can see the same forms being echoed in the doorways that are down there on the bottom right, where it has, they tend to be very elaborate entryways and having a fan light over them and then occasionally side lights to the sides of them. Just the door and the entrances to the house were seen as particularly important and significant, and they were drawing from Roman forms with their archways. Here is this is a federal style structure. You can see here that around our elaborate entryway, again with its fan light over it, then there's sort of this little entry porch, and there are the columns with their entablature running above them. And belt courses are what are each of those sort of little bands that seem to be separating each of the floors until we get up to the top where we have another entablature, and then there's a balustrade running around the cornice line. So it is, you can really definitely see the influences of the classical forms here, although it becomes much more pronounced in our subsequent style, which is the Greek Revival, that specifically takes now, instead of from Roman structures, it draws from Greek ones, and specifically Greek temples. It's extremely popular in the United States from 1825 to 1860, when it is more or less the dominant style. If you are going to build your lovely, nice new house, you are almost certainly going to be building it in the Greek Revival style. Towards the end of the period, you start having some other styles that come up, which we'll talk about later, but Greek Revival is the very, very big American style. It drew from classical Greek forms, especially temples, because they were thought to embody the democratic spirit, which naturally Americans found very important because they looked to Athens and the ancient Greeks as that's what we should aspire to be with our grand democratic experiment, because that's when governments were great and they represented their peoples. And so we wanted the United States to sort of take on that spirit. And then there is also, in the 1820s, a Greek War of Independence going on, in which the Greek peoples are fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Because for the longest time, Greece has not been an independent country. It was, at times, part of the Byzantine Empire or part of the Ottoman Empire. Greece actually hadn't gotten to be an independent people for centuries. And so from 1821 to 1830, they are essentially reasserting themselves as an independent people, and they refer to themselves as the First Hellenic Republic. Briefly, then eventually they become Greece, but as you might notice from even Republic being in there, we can see why the United States would feel sort of a kinship with the Greek people, especially when we have only won our independence from the British less than about 40 years before. So there was this understanding that we and the Greeks were sort of one and the same, and that we should support them in their fight for independence. although America is still a very young country, so we don't have the financial or military resources to really be off fighting a war in Europe with them. So we show our support by building Greek Revival houses and that. It's sort of the, as I said, there's the kinship or the feeling that we should stand up for them or stand with them because we are one and the same in a sense of supporting democracy. And then, so going back to the style itself, I will now again step off of my history teacher podium and go back to actually talking about where does the architecture come in. So here on the left, we have a very lovely Greek Revival house, and you can see how it sort of has the same forms of the Greek temples that you can see over on the right. The one on the top is sort of a ruined temple, and what we would have seen at the time that we thought we were emulating, beneath it is a modern reconstruction of these temples, which you might notice are actually very colorful and well painted. I'm sure some of you might be familiar sort of with these statements that a lot of classical Roman sculptures actually would have been painted very bright, almost garish colors. People are still sort of upset about this idea, but at the time it wasn't known, and it was genuinely thought that they just had these lovely pure white buildings. And so you often see a lot of Greek revivals that are, at least elements like the columns are almost always going to be white. Even if the house itself is brick, a lot of the portions that resemble the temple front are often going to be rendered in white. And the temple front itself is accomplished by the triangular part of the roof at the top, which is called the pediment. So that part of the building is a pediment, which is important to note because when we talk about like, oh, there's a window up in the pediment, that's where it is. It means the triangular bit of the roof. And then beneath it, again, you can see our lovely running entablature that then surmounts the columns. And the columns themselves belong to several, there are different types of columns that are called orders. You have Doric columns that are sort of very plain. They're capital. The top of the column is the capital, is not particularly embellished in any way. It's just sort of flares a bit and it's lovely, but there's not a whole lot to them. And then we have the Ionic columns, which you see on the bottom right there, and those sort of have their scroll work coming off of them. That is the Ionic order of column. And then we have our very decorative Corinthian columns, which are in the top right, and those sort of have those almost plant-like motifs coming off of them. And you can actually see in that one that we have eagles sitting up on the tops of the capitals that are sort of nesting there under the entablature. Another, symbol of, or a very American interpretation of what independence and democracy look like, represented in columns in these very minute architectural details. You should also note that, see, the top right Corinthian columns that we have fluting on them is the term for those sort of narrow vertical bands running along them. The Ionic ones don't have that on the bottom right, but then we have sort of, I would describe what's on the bottom left as an interpretation of a column. It's sort of, in a way, it's almost like a pilaster, and a pilaster is sort of, it's a column that sits almost flush with the wall. It comes out a tiny bit. You can see two of them on the bottom right behind our Ionic columns. You also have Ionic pilasters. So if you see sort of a column that looks like it's been eaten by the wall that it's sitting against, that is a pilaster. And then going back to the bottom left, we have, there's this quoting of elements of the columns, even though it's not really a proper column. And the recessed panel in the middle of it that's running down, we sort of have that dent you might see. That's sort of quoting fluting, even though it's not properly fluted, there's a nod to it and a nod to how classical columns are constructed and exist. This often comes up so that in even modest structures, you will see references to these very specific classical forms. Not everyone will have them perfectly rendered or extremely accurately rendered, often because it would be prohibitively expensive for the average person, but even on more modest houses, you will sort of see quotes or references to these aspects of the architectural styles in Greek Revival. Another way we see this is that you have a full pediment when the bottom of the triangle runs the full way across the roof, and it sort of looks like maybe a child's drawing of a house when you put a triangle on top of a square and they're two very distinct shapes. But alternately, you might have broken pediments, and that's when the bottom of the triangle isn't complete, but they sort of hint at it coming in. So there's that impression of the full pediment even when you don't actually see it there. And in many ways, this could be, you know, sort of cost effective, because if you wanted to have more headroom on your second floor, of course, you know, you have to be somewhat well off if you're getting your house with a second floor still. You might have your windows that could eke up in there. It basically, it's the, it's just another way that we see hints of these styles that we see hints of the elements that define the styles, even when they aren't necessarily perfectly rendered so. And then also, you might have noticed with our Greek revivals, they tend to be not particularly decorative, especially in comparison to like the federal style, which again, I pulled up on the right with its cornice line balustrade. It's very lovely in tablature, the belt courses, and even on the lintels, which are the little blocks that are sitting on tops of the windows. In Greek revivals, our lintels are squared off because they're very plain and utilitarian, as opposed to in the federal style where they might get that nice flair to them. You could describe Greek revivals almost being sort of austere or serious. It doesn't have a lot of time for the fussier decorations of other styles. It's a very stoic, might be a good word in with which to describe the appearance of Greek revival structures. Of course, after several hundred years of having nothing but neoclassical styles and this sort of stuffiness about things must be a certain way because this is how the Greeks and Romans did them, you must have your columns and you must have your lovely temple fronts, then you get the Romantic movement, which is a reaction against a lot of neoclassicism. It's also a reaction against the Enlightenment, which emphasized rationalism. The Romantics said that we should be more focused on emotion and the individual as opposed to and that nature was a significant thing that we should look to for our inspirations. It was a reactionary movement against, but at that point had been several hundred years of very dogmatic approaches to art and literature and philosophy. Neoclassicism was a very orderly sort of way of building things, and you built them according to classical orders. Your columns had classical orders, and you did everything the way that it was supposed to be done. And with the Enlightenment, it was rational thought and science and empirical data, whereas the Romantics said that how you feel, the way that you experience things emotionally, is just as valid and important. Saying this now, our modern sensibility as to what like the individual and emotion is probably going to seem sort of odd in comparison, but it's just important to understand that this was against several centuries of very, very specific sorts of how you should do things. But then we get into styles like the Italianate, which is one of our first Romantic styles. It was inspired by the picturesque artistic movement and sort of drew its inspiration from rambling Italian farmhouses and countryside villas from the medieval period before the Renaissance and also a little bit into the Renaissance. It was, instead of going and looking at buildings that had been there for 1,000 years in the Greek and Roman ruins, it was starting to look to other places for its inspiration. It was especially popular from about 1840 to 1885, and this popularity was greatly fueled because Queen Victoria built her summer house, Osborne House, in the Italianate style or the Italian villa style, which naturally shows that there's a stamp of royal approval on the Italianate, and therefore a stamp of royal approval on a sensibility that is not strictly neoclassical. Here is the Villa del Trebbio, which is a mid-15th century, so 1400s Medici villa in Tuscany. And then below is Osborne House, which was completed in 1851. So about 400 years apart, but you can sort of see here where the inspiration was coming from. Villa del Trebbio was in many ways actually still a fortified castle with a few artistic flourishes, and then you get to the Italianate, which is sort of drawing from those forms with the towers, with those arching shapes, but made it not fortified and made it a lovely house. Some of the elements that we look for in Italianates include these. There's a greater degree of decoration on the outside of the house. It's not as austere as the Greek Revival. It's actually perhaps even more decorative than many of our federal style houses were. There are, up on the tower there, you will see our trios of arched windows that come in trios or pairs, and especially on things like the tower, are a big part of the Italianate style. And then we have these large overhanging eaves that come off and are supported, as you might see, by brackets. The Italianate also tends to feature quoins, which is the term for our lovely little alternating stacks of bricks that go on brick and masonry houses. Those are structural elements, actually, that are there to help these structures support its own weight, although they are often accentuated by making them a different material and color than was used in the construction of the rest of the house. And then they also, if the house doesn't have a tower, there's a good chance that it won't always have a belvedere or a cupola, which sort of sit up there and again hint at our towers. You can see still that we have our sets of arched windows. This one's semi-rectangular, and so we have a trio of arched windows and then 4 arched windows. Again, it's another way that styles might often hint or quote things when they don't fully have them. And then we also have our brackets, which are a very, very significant part of the Italianate style. Our overhanging eaves are almost always going to be supported by brackets, and especially brackets in pairs that are also called friend brackets. Those are one of the truly defining characteristics of the Italianate style. If you see an eave that is being supported by pairs of brackets, there is an extremely good chance it is Italianate, or it could always even be possibly an earlier house that may have been done in the Greek Revival, but somebody remodeling and wanting to seem more fashionable might have added those brackets at a later point, and so it's an Italianate element to them, which that we'll talk more about in the next presentation. And to identify houses, you do run into problems of not every house is built in a style and remains that style. People renovated their homes long before HGTV and wanted to seem like they knew what was going on in the world and they had the money to do these things. And even if they couldn't build a brand new house, they might stick a few of the elements on that were the biggest signifiers of the style, that they were cosmopolitan and up on the latest architectural trends. To the right, you also see these brackets that are holding up the window. Holding up, I say. These are more decorative, as are even the ones that are on the eave. They're not necessarily structural, although some are, most of them are not there, simply there for decoration. But the ones in the window are attached to the crown, which is our lovely little bit of decoration going over our windows. And you still see that we actually have a pediment. There's still these hints of neoclassicism, or I should say hints of classical shapes and forms that we can still recognize, but they aren't dominating the houses in the ways that we saw, especially with the Greek Revival. The whole house isn't resembling a Greek temple front, it's just sort of alluding to some of these things with our forms and shapes. Or sort of concurrently with the Italianate, there's another slightly less clear style, that's the Gothic Revival. And this plays up the medieval fantasy element of Romanticism, because the Romantics started to look back on the medieval period and say that, no, there were some good things after the classical world and before the Renaissance that we should also look to. So they were really the first people to look and say, maybe the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages weren't entirely devoid of culture and life, which had sort of been proposed by a lot of your Renaissance thinkers, that the classical period was the end-all and be-all and nothing had matched it. The Romantics are to say, well, there were some good things that came out of the medieval period. So when looking at that, they naturally looked at Gothic architecture we talked about. And really, Gothic Revival is a fantastical interpretation of Gothic architecture and sort of a Victorian fantasy that has very little to do with actual medieval forms, but it quotes a lot of the decorative elements. It was popular from about 1840 to 1880, roughly concurrently with the Italianate, and Greek Revival is sort of the tail end that's at the beginning of both of these. Gothic Revival is never quite as popular, but it's still a very prominent style, and we do have a few lovely houses in Bath that are Gothic Revival. So when I mentioned sort of those decorative elements that it looks to, we see things like our lancet windows, which are what we call our lovely pointed arches that come back from our Gothic cathedrals. There's also decoration along the eaves that's called verge board. We'll look a bit more at that in a second, and then you might see on the upper right, we have sort of our three-lobed window, which is called a trefoil. There are religious connotations to it because in proper religious art and architecture, it's sort of represented the Holy Trinity. In Gothic architecture, it a lot more just quoted that without necessarily having the same overtones. Or it wasn't always religious, it sort of became a secular architectural element that borrowed from the Gothic religious meanings. And then also down at the bottom, you can see how they have stuck some crenellation over their windows because it drew on medieval castles too. The castles were the worst offender. At the Victorians had a very different idea of what a castle looked like than what a castle ever actually looked like. Still, our conception of the fantasy medieval castle is basically based in Victorian interpretations of them and has very little to do with the historical fortifications. But we do see bits of them quoted in Gothic Revival architecture where crenellation is just used as a decorative element and has in places where it's absolutely not practical as the original crenellations were meant to be. Going back to our point about verge board, that is the name for the lovely little gingerbread that runs along the undersides of your eaves. Or actually it runs along the undersides of your overhanging gable. That which is called the verge, and therefore the boards coming off of it are verge board. These also tend to have sort of natural or more organic shapes to them, unlike in classical styles and forms, which were very austere again and rigid and had a lot of our straight lines. We had our straight columns, our triangular pediments. These are sort of trying to be a bit more natural looking, a bit more maybe floral. Again, it's often in hints. It's not a literal flower, but you can see here, this is actually lovely, how the shadows cast by them sort of look, there's an organicness to them, and that's what they were playing up because that is our romantic resurgence and interest in the natural world, as opposed to all man-made things. Of course, a little ironic that we have our lovely over-decorated house is natural, but it was in comparison to the rigidity of the neoclassical forms. And then here is also a close-up of our little lancet windows with their lovely pointed arch tops that you might think look an awful lot like windows that you see in many churches and cathedrals, and they are because that is exactly where they were borrowing them from. There's also a thing about Gothic Revival houses, is that they tend to, I shouldn't say tend to, they are often cruciform in their shape, which is to be, they are cross-shaped. You don't really see this except from overhead, but if you've ever been in a church, you often have, or a cathedral, you have this very long body, the naves off to the sides and the altar at the front that creates our cross shape. And this is replicated in some Gothic Revival houses that we sort of have this hint at religion again and religiosity. Whether or not it was actually about proper piety, they were borrowing the artistic forms from it. And let me see how we're doing for time. Okay, so we do have time for a bonus style. Richardsonian Romanesque is in many ways another romantic medieval fantasy style. It's drawing from Romanesque architecture, which I didn't talk about, but when buildings were being built before we had Gothic architecture and after Rome, they're broadly called Romanesque, and they featured a lot of round arches to them. as opposed to the pointed arches of our Gothic styles that come in and form our ribbed vaults, and that Romanesque architecture had a preference for very round arches. And so the Richardsonian Romanesque, which was one specific form of Romanesque revival, drew from that medieval predecessor to the Gothic, but it was still sort of looking to the medieval period for these inspirations. And as I said, it featured round arches. They also tend to like round towers with conical roofs and favor asymmetrical facades. And now you might be thinking maybe that there's a building in Bath that would fit a lot of these categories of what a building looks like. I'm sure some of you already know, but our own lovely patent-free library is a Richardsonian Romanesque building. You can see over the original entrance, we have one of our archways. There's another archway sort of hiding on the side that originally was a side entrance that is no longer used. It's now a window. There's a round tower that's built in with its sort of conical roof, although it flows into the roof line itself. And the facade is certainly asymmetrical. The asymmetry is also a big thing. I didn't really mention this when we were looking at Greek Revival and Federal, but symmetry was a very big part of our classical building styles, is that you should split it down the middle and it should be even on both sides. They should be mirror images. Whereas with later, as we start seeing, well, why can't we sort of have a balanced look that's not strictly symmetrical? But that was just another reaction against sort of these very rigid rules and forms that dominated neoclassical styles and architecture. And so now that I've sort of rambled at you about medieval history and then sort of the Renaissance and then sort of a lot of architectural terms, which I'm sure are very confusing, but I hope sort of created a base understanding of like, what is a pilaster? What are sort of our different forms of columns? And really, why were buildings done a certain way? Why was neoclassicism so big, and then why was the reaction against it so significant? That is going to be the end of our proper presentation, so we can open it up to any questions or comments that people might have. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Great job, Jack. Thank you so much.